The night did not warn her. That was the thing about Wyoming winters. They did not announce themselves with ceremony or give a person time to prepare their heart. One evening, the sky was clear and cold and full of stars. By midnight, the wind had changed direction, and by 2 in the morning, the temperature had dropped so fast the snow on the ground hardened into something closer to stone than powder. Nora Calloway heard it before she felt it. The groan of the cabin walls, the hiss of wind pushing through the gap beneath the door, the way the fire in the stove seemed to breathe differently, pulling harder against the cold that pressed from every side. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening, counting. Then she got up. She did not light a lamp. She had made this walk enough times to know every board, every nail, every creak beneath her feet. She pulled on her coat, her second pair of wool socks, her boots with the cracked left sole that let cold air in, no matter how tightly she laced them. She wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes were exposed. Then she opened the cabin door and stepped into the dark. The wind hit her like a wall, 30 feet. That was the distance between her front door and the barn where Scout and Ember stood in the dark waiting for morning. 30 feet of open ground between warmth and the horses that were the only reason she still had a reason to get up before dawn. On a calm night, it was nothing. A short walk, a breath of cold air, and then the warm smell of hay and animal, and the quiet sounds of 2 horses shifting in their stalls. But on a night like this, 30 feet was a different kind of distance. The wind pushed her sideways before she reached the bottom porch step. She grabbed the post and steadied herself, then put her head down and walked. The snow was not deep yet, just a few inches of the hard-packed kind that had been there for weeks, but the wind threw loose crystals across the surface in sheets that stung her eyes even through the scarf. She could not see the barn. She could only walk toward where she knew it was and trust that her feet remembered the path her eyes could not follow. She had done this 39 times since the hard cold began in December. This was the 40th. Inside the barn, the temperature was only slightly warmer than outside. That was the problem. Edmund had built it solid enough with good timber and a tight roof, but a barn 30 feet from a house in the Wyoming Territory in January was still a barn in Wyoming in January. The cold came through the walls in the night and settled into the straw and worked its way into the animals no matter how much hay you piled against the gaps. Nora could feel it the moment she stepped through the barn door and closed it behind her. Still cold, still dangerous, still the kind of temperature that over enough hours turned a living animal into something that lay on its side and did not get up again. Scout heard her first. He shifted in his stall and blew a long breath through his nose. Ember moved a moment later, turning her head toward the sound of Nora's boots on the barn floor. Nora checked them the way she always did. She ran her hands along Scout's legs, first feeling for the kind of stiffness that meant trouble. She found it in his left foreleg, the same place she had been finding it for 3 weeks. A tightness that did not belong there, a resistance in the joint that got worse when the temperature dropped below a certain point. She flexed it gently and Scout pulled back slightly, not in pain exactly, but in the way a creature responds when something is not right, and it does not want that thing pressed on. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to a horse in the dark at 2 in the morning in the middle of a Wyoming winter. She just stood with her hand on his leg for a while, feeling the cold that lived inside it now, and then she moved to Ember and checked her the same way. Ember was fine. Ember was always fine, standing in whatever conditions presented themselves with the steady patience of an animal that had decided early in its life that worry was not worth the energy. Nora spread fresh straw. She checked the water bucket and broke the thin layer of ice that had formed across the top. She added the extra blanket she had brought from the cabin, draping it over Scout's back and securing it at his chest. Then she stood in the middle of that dark, cold barn and looked at the 2 horses that Edmund had chosen for their breeding potential, the 2 horses that were supposed to be the start of something, the foundation of a herd that would grow over years and become the thing that made this land worth the suffering it asked of everyone who tried to live on it. She stood there and she thought about the walk back to the cabin, about doing this again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night until spring came, if spring had came before she or the horses ran out of luck. She thought about Scout's leg and what it meant for his value as a breeding stallion. She thought about Edmund and the way he had talked about these horses when they first brought them to the property in the spring of 1876, 3 years ago now, when the grass was coming up green and the future looked like something that could be shaped by determined hands. Edmund Calloway had been a determined man. He had built the cabin with timber he cut himself from the ridge to the north. He had laid the stone foundation by hand, moving rocks that weighed as much as he did, because he said a house worth living in needed a foundation built to last a century. He had dug the well and cleared the east field and planted the first season's feed crop before the weather turned, and the territory showed them what it actually was beneath the mild summer face it wore to trick newcomers. He had also died in August of 1878, 11 days after the cough started. Pneumonia moved fast in men who had been working hard land for 3 years without enough rest. Nora had been at his side when he went. She had watched his hands, those enormous hands that had moved so many rocks and cut so much timber, go still on the blanket, and she had sat with him for a long time after that before she went outside and stood in the August heat and looked at the 80 acres of raw Wyoming ground that was now entirely and completely her problem. That had been 7 months ago. She had made it this far. She would make it further. Nora walked back to the cabin. The fire had died down while she was gone, and the cabin was cold in the way that empty spaces become cold in the middle of a night like this. Not the killing cold of outside, but the creeping cold that gets into your feet and lower back and makes everything feel harder than it should. She added wood to the stove and sat close to it on the three-legged stool Edmund had made from a timber scrap, pulling her coat tight, waiting for the warmth to come back into the room. She did not sleep again that night. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, Nora had already made the calculation she had been avoiding since December. Scout's leg was getting worse, not better. By the time breeding season came around in spring, that leg would tell every experienced horseman who looked at it exactly what it was: a permanent injury, the kind that did not heal back to full function in a working animal, the kind that reduced what a man would pay for the services of a breeding stallion by a number that could not be talked around or hidden. 40% was the number she had arrived at in her head during the night she lay awake running figures. Maybe more. Which meant Ember had to produce a foal that was worth more than she had originally planned for. Which meant Ember had to stay healthy. Which meant the barn 30 feet away across open ground was not good enough. She knew this. She had known it since December. She had just not yet let herself think past knowing it to the part where she had to do something about it. Spring came slowly that year. March in Wyoming was not spring in any real sense of the word. It was merely a softening, a slight relenting of the cold enough to make the ice on the well bucket thinner in the mornings and the wind slightly less hostile during the middle part of the day. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes and left behind mud that froze again at night and thawed again in the afternoon and turned the ground into something that was neither solid nor liquid and made every walk across the yard a negotiation. Nora was in the cabin on a Tuesday evening in the second week of March when she went looking for the mallet she needed to repair a section of fence the winter had pulled loose. She did not find the mallet in its usual place on the shelf above the door. She found it in the bottom of a wooden box that Edmund had kept under the work table. A box she had not opened since before he died because the work table had been his space, and going into it had felt for the first months like a kind of trespass. She found the mallet. She also found beneath it a folded piece of paper. She almost did not open it. There was something about the way it was folded carefully with deliberate creases that told her it had been put there on purpose and not just dropped in with other things. Edmund had been a deliberate man. He did not put things places by accident. She opened it. It was a promissory note. Edmund's handwriting careful and slightly cramped the way it always was when he was writing something he wanted to be exact about. The date was June of 1877. The amount was $340. The lender was a man named Silas Greer. The collateral was 40 acres on the eastern boundary of the Callaway property. The due date was September of 1880. Nora read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of the cabin, not on a chair, not on the stool, but on the floor itself with the paper in her hands and the light from the stove, the only light in the room, and she read it a third time. $340. Edmund had borrowed that money to purchase the additional eastern acreage when the original homestead claim came through the 40 acres that included the spring-fed creek that was the only reliable water source on the property. Without those 40 acres, the well in the yard would be the only water and wells in Wyoming ran dry and ran bitter and ran out in ways that springs did not. The eastern acres with the creek were not extra land. They were the land that made the rest of it viable. She did not know why he had not told her. She would wonder about that for a long time afterward without arriving at an answer that satisfied her. Maybe he had planned to tell her, and the time had never seemed right. Maybe he had thought he would pay it before it became a problem and had not wanted to worry her. Maybe there were parts of what he carried that he kept inside himself the way some men did, not from dishonesty, but from a kind of protection that ended up looking like the same thing from the outside. Whatever the reason, he was gone and the note was real, and September of 1880 was 17 months away. Silas Greer. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Greer ran the largest spread in the county, 800 acres to the north and west, a working ranch with 40 head of cattle, and a reputation for buying land from families who could not hold on to it. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He did not threaten people directly or use violence or behave in ways that would draw the attention of the federal land office. He was patient. That was what people said about him when they were being careful about what they said. He was a patient man. He waited. He bought. Nora rode to his property on a Thursday morning and presented herself at his door. He received her in what passed for a parlor in a territory ranch house, a room with 2 good chairs and a desk and a window that looked north toward his cattle pasture. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders with gray in his beard, and the kind of hands that had done hard work for many years and then stopped needing to. He read the copy she had made of the note and handed it back to her without any change in his expression. She told him she intended to pay. She told him she had a plan for generating the income from the horses by breeding season. She told him she needed the full time agreed upon in the note. He listened to all of it. Then he looked at her for a moment without speaking, and when he did speak, his voice was entirely reasonable, the voice of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone and knew it. "I'm a patient man, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "September will come either way." That was all. She rode home with the copy of the note in her coat pocket and the full understanding that Silas Greer was not a man who would extend grace and was not a man who wanted money. What he wanted was 40 acres of Wyoming land that happened to have a creek on it, and 17 months was the amount of time he was willing to wait before he got it, which meant Ember had to produce a foal that sold for enough money to cover the debt and then some, which meant Ember had to winter safely, which meant the barn 30 feet from the cabin door was not good enough. Nora sat on the stone floor of the cabin that evening with a candle and a piece of paper, and she began to think. Not about the note, not about Greer. Those were problems she could not solve with thinking. She thought about the barn. She thought about what was wrong with it and why it was wrong, and whether the wrongness was a fixed condition of the world or a problem with a solution she had not yet found. She thought about heat and cold and how they moved. She thought about the winter she had just survived and the nights she had spent in that barn and the way the cold came from everywhere at once, from the ground and the walls and the air itself, as though it had no source that could be addressed, only a total presence that pushed back against every attempt to fight it. And then she stopped thinking about the cold and started thinking about the floor beneath her hands. Stone. Edmund's foundation laid with careful hands, each stone chosen for flatness and fit. Below the stone earth. The earth that had been here before Edmund, before any of this, before the territory was anything but ground and sky and the creatures that had figured out how to live inside it. She pressed her palm flat against the floor. The stone was cold near the edges where the outside walls met the ground and let cold air creep along the bottom. But in the center of the cabin, where the stone had been sitting above packed earth since Edmund laid it, it held a different temperature. Not warm exactly, but not the cold of outside. Something in between. Something that the earth itself produced from below a steady baseline that the stone kept and the cold air could not entirely strip away. Nora sat with her hand on the floor for a long time. Below this floor was earth. Below this stone was several feet of packed Wyoming dirt. Below that, more dirt below, that the deep ground that did not freeze even in the worst winters because the cold only reached so far down before the insulating weight of the earth itself stopped it. She had heard this. She had not thought about what it meant until now. Miners knew it. Men who dug wells knew it. Anyone who had spent time underground in summer knew that the earth held a temperature that had nothing to do with the weather above. The barn was cold because it sat on top of the earth without using it. The barn was cold because it was a wooden structure surrounded by air on all sides, and air carried cold everywhere and offered no resistance to it. But if the horses were not above the earth, not beside it, but inside it, below the surface, surrounded by it on all sides, the way a root cellar held its temperature through the worst July heat and the worst January freeze. Then the cold that killed horses would not be able to reach them. Not because of fire, not because of blankets, because of the earth itself doing what it had always done, which was hold steady while the world above it changed. She did not sleep that night either. By morning she had a plan. She would excavate beneath the cabin. She would dig out a space large enough for 2 horses using the stone foundation that Edmund had built as the overhead structure, the walls of earth as insulation, and a staircase through the cabin floor as the passage between her living space and the animals below. She would cut ventilation shafts for air movement. She would build drainage channels for water and waste management. She would build the horses a barn that no wind could reach and no temperature could destroy, because it would not be a structure sitting on top of the land, but a space carved into the land itself. She told Helen Pratt about it 2 days later. Helen had been her nearest neighbor for 4 years. Her husband had died the previous spring, a different illness in a different season, and she and Nora had an understanding between them that did not require much conversation. They checked on each other. They helped each other with things that required 2 sets of hands. They were not close friends in the way that some women were, but they were the particular kind of neighbors that the territory produced, connected by proximity and shared difficulty in ways that ran deeper than affection. Helen stood in Nora's yard with her arms crossed and listened to the full explanation without interrupting. When Nora finished, Helen was quiet for a moment. "Nora," she said, "this isn't grief anymore. This is something else." Nora looked at her. "It's engineering," she said. Helen shook her head slowly. "You're going to dig out the ground under your own house, under the back corner, away from the foundation perimeter, and keep horses under there." "Yes." Helen looked at the cabin, then she looked at Nora. The expression on her face was not unkind. It was the expression of a woman who was genuinely worried about another woman and did not know what to do with that worry except put it into words. "The smell alone will drive you out," Helen said, "and the damp. And if you disturb that foundation wrong, the whole back wall comes down." "I won't disturb the foundation." "You don't know that." "I've looked at it. I've measured it. The foundation runs the perimeter. I'm digging interior space, not under the walls. The load-bearing structure stays untouched." Helen said nothing to that. She was not an engineer, and she knew it. And arguing technical points she did not understand was not something she did. She simply looked at Nora for a long moment with the particular kind of concern that has nowhere useful to go, and then she went home. 3 days after that conversation, Silas Greer stood outside the general store on the main road through town and said what he said. Nora was not there to hear it directly. She heard it from 2 different people before the end of the day, which meant it had been said loudly and in front of enough ears to carry. He had spoken about her plan in terms that were not technically insulting, but arranged in a way that left nothing positive standing. He had said that a woman who dug under her own house was a woman who had already given up. He had said it was a shame what grief did to people who did not have the support they needed. He had said it in the patient, reasonable voice of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone and knew that. Nora heard the reports and said nothing to anyone. She went home and looked at the cabin floor and thought about September of 1880 and Edmund's handwriting on that folded piece of paper. She began digging in the first week of April. She lifted 3 floorboards in the back corner of the cabin, the corner farthest from the stone hearth and farthest from the front wall, and she descended into the darkness beneath with a shovel and a bucket and a lantern she hung from a nail. She drove into the underside of the floor above her. The space below the cabin was 4 feet high, which meant she could not stand upright. She worked crouched and then kneeling as she got further from the entry, moving earth in bucketfuls that she hauled up through the opening and carried outside and dumped in the growing mound at the north side of the property. The first day she moved less than she had planned. The soil was good, not too rocky, not too clay heavy, but the work of crouching and digging and hauling was different from any other physical labor she had done. It found muscles she did not know she had and informed her immediately that they were not ready. She could feel it in her lower back within the first 2 hours, a deep ache that was not the sharp pain of injury, but the steady complaint of work the body had not prepared for. She kept going until the light was gone. The neighbors who passed on the road that week saw her carrying buckets. They saw the pile of earth growing at the north corner. They watched her go in and out of the cabin with the particular repetitive rhythm of someone engaged in something that would take a very long time. Some of them stopped and looked. Some of them did not stop, but looked anyway, slowing their horses or their wagons just enough to take in what they were seeing before moving on. On the 9th day of April, Nora received a formal letter. It came from the Wyoming Territorial Land Management Office and bore the stamp of official correspondence. It stated that a concern had been filed regarding possible modification to a property under active collateral agreement, specifically the Callaway Homestead, on record with the Greer Promissory Note of June 1877. The concern alleged that structural alterations to the dwelling might constitute a material change to the property held as collateral, potentially triggering the acceleration clause in the note, which would make the full amount of $340 due immediately rather than at the September 1880 date specified. She was given 60 days to submit a written response demonstrating that the modifications did not affect the structural integrity or assessed value of the property. She read the letter standing at the work table. She set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in the same wooden box where she had found Edmund's note. Silas Greer had not waited long. She had understood from the moment she left his parlor after their one conversation that patience was a tool he used rather than a virtue he possessed. He had been waiting for something to use, and she had given it to him. Not because she had been careless, but because there was no version of this plan that did not involve digging, and no version of digging that he could not characterize as a structural modification if he chose to. He had watched and waited and chosen his moment with the precision of a man who had done this before with other properties and other families. She went back into the hole the next morning. The work was brutal in a way that she had expected and in ways she had not. She had expected the physical difficulty. She had not fully expected the isolation of it, the way hours spent in a cramped, dark space doing repetitive work separated her from the rhythm of the world above in a way that felt different from ordinary solitude. The lantern light cast the same shadows in the same patterns. The ceiling of floorboards stayed the same distance above her head. The earth she moved was the same earth bucket after bucket, an apparently inexhaustible supply of more earth to be moved before she reached the space she needed. She thought about Edmund while she dug. She thought about the paper in the wooden box and the careful creases he had put in it. She thought about the horses. She thought about the creek in the eastern acres and the sound it made in spring when the snowmelt ran through it fast and cold and clear. She thought about what it would mean to lose those acres to a man who had already decided he would have them. She dug. Week after week, the pile at the north corner grew. Her hands blistered, and the blisters hardened and became calluses. Her back stopped complaining quite as loudly because the muscles had adjusted to the new demands placed on them. She lost weight. She could see it in the way her clothing fit, in the way her face looked in the small mirror Edmund had hung above the wash basin. Her cheeks hollowed. Her eyes looked different, not harder exactly, but more fixed on whatever was directly in front of them, less given to wandering. The people of the territory talked about her. She knew this without being told directly. She heard it in the way conversations paused when she rode into town. She heard it in the carefully neutral way people asked how things were going, the studied absence of anything specific in their questions that told her the specific things were being discussed behind her back. She did not care about the talk. She had 60 days from the date of the letter to file a response she did not yet know how to write. She had 17 months until September 1880, in a debt she could only service through the health and productivity of animals she could not afford to lose. And somewhere beneath her cabin floor, the space she needed was still not large enough for 2 horses. She went back into the hole each morning, and she dug. In the last week of April, she hit stone. Not a small stone, not a pocket of rocks that a few extra hours would clear. A ledge of granite that ran diagonally beneath the eastern portion of the excavation, thick and unmoved and entirely indifferent to the plans of a 36-year-old widow with a shovel and a deadline. She tapped it with the pick end of her tool, and it rang back at her with the sound of something that had no intention of giving way easily. She sat in the dark beside the ledge for a long time. The lantern light moved slightly as the air shifted. Somewhere above her, the cabin floor held the weight of everything Edmund had built. Somewhere north, the pile of excavated earth sat in the spring air, waiting for more of itself to join it. And here at the eastern edge of what she needed to be the floor of a stable, the earth had put down a barrier of stone, and told her that things were not going to go as planned. She climbed out of the hole and walked to the supply shed and found the steel chisel Edmund had used for the stone foundation work and brought it back down into the hole. She set the point against the granite. She picked up the hammer. She began. It would take 3 weeks to clear 8 feet of that ledge. 3 weeks of hammer and chisel in the cramped dark, the noise of it filling the space beneath the floor, the chips of granite accumulating in the corners. 3 weeks during which the 60-day clock from the land office kept moving, and Ember moved through her days in the stall above, and Silas Greer sat in his parlor on his 800 acres and waited for September to come either way. Nora did not know in those 3 weeks of chiseling through stone in the dark whether she would make it. She did not know if the space would be ready before winter. She did not know if she could write a response to the land office that would hold. She did not know if Helen Pratt would be the only person in the territory who acknowledged what she was trying to do. And she was not entirely sure Helen's version of acknowledgement counted as support. What she knew was the granite under the chisel. What she knew was the specific resistance of that stone and the specific force required to move against it. What she knew was that the ground did not care about her reasons, or her grief, or her deadline, or the note in Edmund's handwriting in the wooden box under the work table. The ground only responded to work. So she worked. The granite gave way on a Tuesday. Not all at once, not in the dramatic fashion of something that had been holding for a long time and finally released. It gave way the way hard things give way to patient work, gradually one chip at a time until the morning. Nora set the chisel against the last section of the ledge and drove the hammer down and felt the resistance change beneath her hands into something that crumbled rather than rang back at her. She worked through that last section in 4 hours, hauled the debris up in buckets, and then sat in the cleared space with the lantern between her knees and looked at the floor she had made. Dirt again, plain Wyoming dirt, not the deep reddish stone that had stopped her for 3 weeks, just ordinary earth that a shovel could move and a bucket could carry. She pressed her palm flat against it the way she had pressed her palm against the cabin floor on the March night when the idea had come to her. The temperature held. Below the surface that had given her such trouble, the ground was exactly what she needed it to be. She climbed out, walked to the water barrel by the back wall, drank 2 cups without stopping, and went back down. May arrived and the territory made one of its occasional gestures towards something other than hostility. The days lengthened. The mud in the yard dried enough to walk across without losing a boot heel. The creek in the eastern acres ran fast with snow melt, and in the evenings, if the wind came from the south, the air smelled briefly like something that was not cold. Nora noticed these things the way a person notices weather when they are living mostly underground. She came up for light and air and to haul the filled buckets to the north dump pile, and she went back down to the work. 20 cubic feet of earth per day. That was what she had been moving since April, more on the days when the soil was cooperative, less on the days when it packed hard or when her back made its opinions known. The total volume she needed to remove before the space could fit 2 horses of Scout and Ember's size was something she had calculated on paper and recalculated 3 times to make sure she had not made an error. The number was not encouraging, but it was not infinite, and the only difference between a number you could not reach and a number you could was whether you kept moving toward it each day. The people who passed on the road had stopped slowing down to look. This was either because they had grown accustomed to the sight of the widow Calloway carrying dirt in buckets from a hole beneath her cabin, or because looking had begun to feel like an acknowledgement that she might know what she was doing, and they were not ready to concede that. Nora paid equal attention to both possibilities, which was to say none at all. Silas Greer she did not see during those weeks. She heard about him, as she heard about most things in the territory, through the second-hand reports that arrived when she rode into town for supplies. He had sold 2 horses at the spring auction in Laramie. He had added fence to his northern pasture. He had been seen speaking with a county land assessor at some length, though what that conversation had contained was not something anyone seemed to know or was willing to speculate about in her presence. She wrote her response to the land office in the evenings at the work table by the light of the stove. This was not easy writing. She had never written to a government office before, and she did not know the particular language such offices expected. She wrote it plainly, describing the excavation in precise terms, explaining that the cabin's stone foundation perimeter was entirely untouched, that the work was taking place in the interior space beneath the floor, and not beneath or adjacent to any load-bearing structure. She cited the dimensions of the foundation, which she measured again to make sure she had them exactly right. She described where the excavation was located in relation to the foundation. She used words like structural integrity and load-bearing capacity and collateral value with the care of someone who was not entirely sure of the vocabulary, but was certain of the facts behind it. She had 40 days left on the 60-day clock when she finished the draft. She read it over twice, changed 3 sentences, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Wyoming Territorial Land Management Office. Then she set it on the table and looked at it. She could not take it herself. The ride to the land office was most of a day each way, and the stage that carried mail to the territorial capital ran on Thursdays, which meant leaving on Wednesday and returning Friday, and losing 2 full days of excavation work when she was already behind the pace she needed to clear the stone she had lost 3 weeks to. She calculated the numbers again and arrived at the same answer. She could not afford 2 days. She did not sleep well that night. The following morning, she went down into the hole and began moving dirt again, and at some point in the middle of the afternoon, she heard footsteps on the floor above her. The particular sound of someone moving through the cabin with deliberate quiet, not trying to hide themselves, but not announcing themselves either. She came up through the opening with the bucket in her hand and found Helen Pratt standing at the work table reading the envelope addressed to the land office. Helen looked up when Nora came through the floor. She looked at Nora for a moment without speaking. Then she looked back at the envelope. "Is this ready to go?" she said. Nora set the bucket down. "Yes." "I'll take it Thursday," Helen said. "I need to go to town anyway." She set the envelope back on the table precisely where she had found it and walked out of the cabin without another word. Nora stood in the middle of the room with dirt on her hands and looked at the space where Helen had been. Then she picked up the empty bucket and went back down into the hole. She would think about that later, about what it had cost Helen to do what she had done without being asked. Helen had not agreed with the plan. Helen had told her plainly that it was dangerous and that the smell would drive her out and that the foundation could come down. None of that had changed. But Helen had also looked at the envelope on the table and understood what it meant, that it was still sitting there, and she had done the only thing that was actually useful without making Nora ask for it. That was the kind of help that mattered on the frontier. Not agreement, not approval, just the specific action that needed doing, delivered without ceremony. June came warm and dry, and in the first week of it, Nora noticed something about Ember. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of noticing that happens when you spend hours each day with an animal, and you know its body and its behaviors the way you know the sounds of your own house at night. Ember stood differently than she had in spring. Her sides had a particular fullness that was not fat, not the soft broadening of an animal on good spring grass, but something denser and more purposeful. Her movements had a quality of deliberateness that was subtle enough that a less attentive person would not have seen it. Nora checked her that evening in the barn. She ran her hands along Ember's barrel and pressed gently and felt what she had suspected. She stood back and looked at Ember for a long moment, doing the arithmetic in her head. February, Ember had been running with Scout in the winter pasture before the hard cold closed everything down. February, which meant a foal due in late December or January of 1880, which meant that in the winter she was building this stable to survive. There would not be 2 horses to shelter, but 3. She leaned against the stall wall and looked at Ember, who looked back at her with the calm, uncomplicated attention of an animal that did not understand timelines or promissory notes or 60-day response windows. The news was good. She told herself this clearly stated it without qualification. A foal from Scout and Ember, healthy and well-bred, would sell for more than any other single thing on her property. A buyer who knew horses would look at the parentage and look at the animal and pay a price that could reach the number she needed and then some. This was the thing she had been working toward since she found Edmund's note in the wooden box. This was the mechanism by which September 1880 became a date she could survive. But a foaling mare and a newborn needed warmth that a Wyoming barn in January could not reliably provide. She had known this before she found out about the pregnancy. She knew it with additional force now. The excavation was no longer a plan for protecting existing animals through a hard winter. It was the specific condition required for a specific life to begin under conditions that allowed it to continue. She went back down into the hole the next morning, and she did not think about anything except the dirt she was moving. July was the month the work changed. The excavation had been the part she could not entirely visualize from above, the part that required her to be in the dark with a lantern and a shovel, and trust that the space accumulating around her was the space the plan required. But in July, the excavation was done. The space beneath the back portion of the cabin was cleared to the dimensions she had calculated: 8 feet of headroom throughout the main area, enough floor space for 2 horses and a third smaller animal, and the passage between their stalls and the base of the staircase. The earth walls were packed and firm. The floor was level, which had taken additional work at the north end, where the grade had wanted to run downhill. Now she was building. The stall frames went up first timber she had measured and cut from the supply shed stock and from lumber she had traded for in town, giving the general store a half-day's labor in exchange for boards. The frames were simple, just vertical posts set in the packed earth floor and connected with horizontal rails, the kind of stall construction any rancher built without instructions. Simple was correct down here. Simple would last. Simple could be repaired with whatever was at hand. The ventilation shafts required more thought. She cut 2 openings through the cabin floor, smaller than the main access hatch, positioned at opposite ends of the stable space. She extended these with wooden tubes she built from boards, running them up through the floor and out through the cabin walls near the roofline on opposite sides of the house. The theory was straightforward. Air would enter through one shaft and exit through the other, driven by the temperature differential between the stable air and the outside. She had seen this principle at work in root cellars. She believed it would work here. She would know for certain when winter came. The drainage channels took the longest. She dug them herself, shallow trenches in the stable floor, running toward a sump pit she excavated in the far corner, deep enough to collect seepage water, and waste runoff wide enough to stay clear with regular maintenance. She lined them with flat stones she carried down the stairs one at a time. The work was tedious in a way that the excavation had not been. Not difficult, but painstaking, requiring a level of attention to small detail that was harder to sustain than the brute repetitiveness of moving dirt. She worked through the heat of July without complaint and without particular observation of the fact that it was hot. The space below the cabin stayed cooler than the air above, which was one confirmation, a small one, but real, of the principles she had built everything on. The earth held its temperature. The ground did not care what the air above it was doing. By the first week of August, she built the staircase. It descended from the access hatch in the cabin floor at an angle she had calculated to fit within the available space. 12 steps of solid timber, tread each one wide enough to walk down without holding the side rails. Though she built side rails anyway, because there would be nights when she came down in the dark and tired, and she did not want to think about the edge on those nights. The staircase felt, when she walked down it for the first time on a finished afternoon, like the truest part of the whole undertaking. Everything else had been about creating the space. This was about living in relationship with it. She stood at the bottom of the stairs in the finished stable and looked at what she had built. It was not beautiful. It was not the kind of space anyone would describe with admiring language or point to as evidence of craftsmanship. The walls were earth dark and slightly damp at the lower sections, packed to a firmness that held its shape. The ceiling was the underside of the cabin floor, the rough bottoms of boards she had walked across for 2 years now, overhead in a different context. The stalls were plain timber. The ventilation shafts were wooden tubes that disappeared upward into the floor above. The drainage channels were lines of flat stone in the earthen floor. But the temperature was 58 degrees in the first week of August, while the air outside pushed past 90. And the air moved. She could feel it, a slow, deliberate circulation that was not a breeze exactly, but was not stillness either. It was the stable breathing the way she had intended it to breathe, exchanging its air slowly through the 2 shafts in a continuous, quiet process that required nothing from her once it was built. She had built a thing that worked. In September, she led Scout down the stairs. He was reluctant at the entrance, planting his feet at the top of the staircase and looking down with the sideways skepticism of a horse encountering an entirely new category of situation. She did not force him. She waited, holding his lead at the bottom of the first step, letting him read the air coming up from below, letting him assess the space he could not yet see by the information available to his senses at the threshold. He stood there for a long time, nostrils working, ears moving. Then he took the first step down. He reached the stable floor and stood still for a full minute. Then he moved toward the near stall and put his head down and sniffed the earth floor and the straw bedding she had laid. His ears settled, his breathing evened. He was in an enclosed space underground, which was nothing a horse had been designed to accept, and he was accepting it with the particular pragmatism of an animal that could read the absence of threat when it was actually absent. Ember came down more easily. She walked the staircase with the careful deliberateness of a mare who was carrying something and knew it at placing each hoof with a thoughtfulness that Scout had not shown. She reached the floor and walked directly to the far stall and stood in it and began eating the hay Nora had put there, as though she had always eaten her hay underground. Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched them. Scout in one stall, Ember in the other, the ventilation shafts carrying their slow exchange of air, the earth walls holding their steady temperature around all three of them. It was September of 1879. She had started digging in April. Outside, the first cool nights of autumn had arrived. Not cold yet, not the serious cold, just the first signal from the north that things were about to change in the way they changed each year. The slow turning of the season that everyone in the territory could read by now, could feel in the particular quality of morning air and the angle of afternoon light. She climbed back up the stairs and walked to the cabin window and looked north. The land office had sent a response to her submission in August. Brief, formal, written in the language of territorial bureaucracy. The submitted documentation had been reviewed. No structural violation had been identified. The matter was closed pending further review of the final state of the property. She had read it twice and then put it in the wooden box with Edmund's note. Closed pending further review meant she had answered the first move. It did not mean Silas Greer was finished. He was not finished. She knew this the way she knew the weather, by reading the available signs rather than by receiving direct information. He had not been to her property. He had not sent another letter. But the county land assessor had ridden out in late August and made a quiet inspection of the exterior of the cabin and noted things in a small book he carried. The assessor had been courteous and said nothing specific, which said everything she needed to know about who had sent him and why. She had let him walk the perimeter of the cabin. She had answered his questions about the foundation with the same precise language she had used in her letter to the land office. She had not offered to show him the stable below because he had not asked, and she saw no reason to provide information that had not been requested to a man working on behalf of someone who wanted her land. When he left, she had gone back to the stable and checked on Ember and stood for a while in the steady temperature below the cabin floor and thought about the months ahead. November arrived and the easy part of autumn ended. The first real cold came down from the north in the second week of the month. Not the killing cold, not yet, but the cold that preceded the killing cold. The advance notice the territory sent before it committed to what it was actually going to do. The mornings grew dark longer. The creek in the eastern acres slowed and grew a thin skin of ice at the edges by midday. The horses in the stable below showed none of the restlessness that usually accompanied the first cold, the shifting and stamping and noise that said an animal could feel what was coming and did not like it. They stood in their stalls and ate and were quiet. Nora stood at the cabin window in the evenings and watched the light leave the sky in the north, that particular flat gray, dimming that meant the cold front was sitting up there gathering itself. She had made it through one winter on this land with Edmund. She had made it through the following winter alone, barely. She had spent the summer and fall of 1879 building the things she believed would change what winter meant for her and for the animals that were the only reason any of this continued to make sense. She watched the sky and she waited. In the first week of December, she opened the trapdoor in the cabin floor and climbed down the stairs and checked the thermometer she had hung on the wall of the stable between the two stalls. Outside the cabin, the air temperature was 11 degrees. In the stable, the thermometer read 54. She stood in front of it for a moment. 54 degrees. When the earth outside was frozen solid and the air above it had dropped below freezing, and every conventional barn in the territory was fighting the cold with body heat and straw and drafty walls, the space she had carved from the ground below her cabin was 54 degrees. She looked at Scout, who was eating. She looked at Ember, who was standing with one hip dropped in the relaxed posture of an animal that was not cold or anxious or burning its energy reserves just to maintain its body temperature. She looked at the earth walls around them, the ceiling of boards above them, the slow movement of air through the ventilation shafts that kept the space from going stale. She had been right. She climbed back up the stairs and closed the trap door and sat down on the three-legged stool beside the stove. The fire was small as it needed to be to maintain the careful balance of warmth in the cabin above without pulling too much heat from the shared structure. The thermometer in the stable was 54. Outside, 11 degrees and falling. She did not say anything to anyone that evening. She did not ride to town to report what she had found on the thermometer. She did not send a letter to the land office, or to Silas Greer, or to Helen Pratt. She sat on the stool beside the small fire and looked at the trap door in her floor and felt something she had not felt since the August morning when she found Edmund's careful note in the wooden box. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter than either of those things. The specific feeling of a person who has done a precise and difficult thing and confirmed that it has worked before the world has had the chance to test it in the conditions that will matter most. The conditions that would matter most were coming. She could feel them in the north. She could feel them in the temperature that dropped a degree further each night, and in the way the horses had grown their winter coats thicker than the previous year, as though they knew something about the coming months that the people around them were only beginning to suspect. She could feel it in the flat gray sky that sat over the territory like a lid on a pot pressing down, holding everything underneath it in a suspension that would not last. January was still weeks away. She tended the fire. She checked on Ember each morning and evening, watching the steady expansion of the mare's sides, counting the weeks, running the numbers in her head, the way she ran all the numbers in her head, the debt and the date, and the value of a healthy foal and the temperature in the stable, and the days remaining until September 1880, and beneath all of it, the steady, unchanging truth of the earth below her feet that held its temperature through everything the sky could throw at it. The world above was gathering itself. Below it, in the quiet dark, two horses breathed and ate and waited warmer than they had any right to be. The snow began on the evening of January 7th. Nothing about it suggested what it was going to become. It came down in the ordinary way of early winter snow, small flakes falling straight through, still air settling on the yard and the fence rails and the roof of the supply shed with the quiet indifference of weather that had no particular intention. Nora watched it from the cabin window for a few minutes, read nothing alarming in it, and went to bed. She woke at midnight to a sound she had not heard since the winter Edmund was still alive. It was the sound of the territory deciding. The wind came from the northwest, and it did not build gradually the way wind usually built. It arrived at full force, slamming against the north wall of the cabin with a concussive pressure that rattled the window glass in its frame and drove snow horizontally across the yard in sheets so dense they erased everything beyond 10 feet. The temperature dropped while she lay there, listening to it dropped in the way it sometimes dropped in Wyoming in January, not incrementally, but in a fall, as though something overhead had opened and released all the cold it had been holding since November. She got up and added wood to the stove. She did not go outside. There was nothing outside worth dying for tonight. She opened the trap door in the cabin floor and descended the stairs to the stable below. Scout and Ember turned their heads when she came down. The lantern threw warm shadows across the earth walls. The thermometer on the wall between the stalls read 52 degrees. Above her, through the boards of the cabin floor, she could hear the wind working against the structure of the house, searching for the gaps that would let it in. Down here, there were no gaps. There was only earth and timber and the slow, steady breathing of two horses in a space the cold could not find its way into. She checked the ventilation shafts. Air was moving through them. She could feel it at the openings, a slow exchange that kept the stable from going stale without surrendering the warmth. She checked the drainage channels. She checked Scout's water and broke the thin skim of ice that had formed at the edge, not from the cold of the stable, but from the cold that traveled down the ventilation shaft and touched the surface. Ember was standing in the far stall. Nora looked at her for a moment with the lantern held out. Something in the mare's posture was different from the posture she wore in ordinary standing, in the relaxed hip-dropped stance of an animal at rest. She was standing squarely on all 4 feet, weight distributed evenly, her head low and her sides moving with a breathing pattern that was slightly faster than it should have been. Her tail moved in a specific way. Nora set the lantern on the post of the stall and put both hands on Ember's sides and felt what was happening. The foal was coming. 2 weeks earlier, close to it. The exact date had always been an estimate based on when she believed that conception had occurred, and estimates about such things were exactly that. The foal was coming tonight in the middle of the worst storm the territory had seen since the winter. Edmund died, and there was no veterinarian within 20 miles. No neighbor she could reach through what was happening on its side. No one who could come, and no one she could go to. There was only her and Ember, and the storm pressing against the world above them. She did not panic. She had seen Folings before, had assisted with two during the years she and Edmund had worked together on the property. She knew what the process looked like when it was going correctly, and she knew the signs that said it was not. She cleared the far corner of the stall and spread fresh straw, more than she would normally use, building up a thick, dry bed against the packed earth floor. She brought down the additional blankets she had stored on the shelf near the base of the stairs. She set the lantern where it would give her the best light without being in the way. Then she sat down in the straw beside Ember, and she waited. The storm above them raged through the night. She could hear it in a remote way, muffled by the earth and the floor between her and the outside world, reduced to something that sounded like distance rather than immediate threat. The wind that was tearing across the Wyoming prairie, driving snow into drifts against every structure that stood in its path, reached the stable only as a low vibration in the walls and a faint variation in the movement of air through the ventilation shafts. The thermometer held at 50 degrees, then 48 as the storm outside drove temperatures down below what she had planned for. Then it held at 48 and did not drop further because the earth does not give up its temperature in a single night, no matter what the air above it decides to do. Ember worked through the night the way mares have worked through 10,000 years of nights like this, with a focused physical effort that had nothing to do with fear or drama, and everything to do with the simple, insistent biology of a new creature demanding its arrival. Nora stayed beside her, hands ready, talking in the low, continuous tone that horses responded to, not from the meaning of the words, but from the steadiness of a human voice that said, "Nothing is wrong here. I am with you. Keep going." The foal arrived in the early hours of January 8th, a filly, small but complete, her legs already searching for the floor before she was fully clear of her mother, doing exactly what foals do in their first minutes of life, which is attempt to stand before they have the coordination to accomplish it. Nora cleared the foal's face and rubbed her dry with the blankets, working quickly and without wasted motion. And the filly shook her head with the startled indignation of a creature encountering air for the first time. Nora sat back in the straw and looked at the filly, trying to organize her legs beneath her. Above them, the storm drove snow against the north wall of the cabin. The temperature outside was somewhere below 20 below zero and falling. Every conventional barn in the territory was fighting that temperature with whatever it had: straw and body heat and luck and prayer. And here, in a space no one had believed in, carved from the earth by a woman with a shovel and a chisel and a reason that had felt like grief to everyone watching and had been something else entirely, a horse had just been born in 50 degrees. The filly stood on her fourth attempt, unsteady, absurd, with the disproportionate length of her legs, but standing. Nora did not cry. She was too tired and too cold in her hands and too present in the moment for crying. She simply watched the filly stand and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the March evening she had found Edmund's note and understood what it meant. She climbed the stairs at dawn and looked out the cabin window at a world that had been replaced overnight. The yard was gone. The fence was gone. The supply shed was a shape under a white mass that had consumed its lower half. Snow had been driven against the cabin walls to window height on the north and west sides, and the wind was still moving, still throwing loose snow across the surface in waves that made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. The thermometer she kept outside the window read 28 below zero. She went back down to the stable and stayed there. The second day of the storm was the same as the first, except colder. Nora made the vertical trip between the cabin above and the stable below, dozens of times, tending the stove and the fire and the animals in their proper rotation, existing in a narrow vertical world of 2 floors connected by a wooden staircase, while the horizontal world outside ceased to be accessible. She watched the filly nurse and stand and lie down and stand again. She watched Ember move through the first hours of new motherhood with the calm attention of a mare who had found her footing. She watched Scout in his stall, steady and unbothered, eating his hay with the philosophical equanimity of a horse that had found an acceptable situation and saw no reason to complicate it. On the morning of the third day, someone knocked on the cabin door. Not the heavy knocking of a person with full strength and full intention. The particular knock of a person whose hands were not working well and who was not certain they had the force to make themselves heard. 2 strikes, then 2 more. Then a pause that was too long. Nora crossed the cabin in 4 steps and opened the door. Helen Pratt stood on the porch. She was coated in snow from her shoulders to her boots, the kind of coating that meant she had been moving through the storm for long enough that the snow had built up layers rather than being continuously blown off. Her face was the color of things that have been too cold for too long. Not white, but a gray white that had nothing alive in it. Her eyes were open and focused, but there was a quality of effort in keeping them that way that Nora recognized. "My horse," Helen said. Her voice was wrong, too quiet, and without its usual shape. "One died this morning. The other one is still standing, but it won't be for long. I can't get to the barn. The drift is taller than the door." Nora pulled her inside. She sat Helen by the stove and put her hands around a cup and got warmth moving back through her while she calculated what was possible. Getting to Helen's barn was not possible. The barn was 3/4 of a mile away in conditions that had already nearly killed a woman making a shorter trip in less time. Getting Helen's surviving horse to this property was also not possible, not through what was outside. But the horse did not need to come to this property. The horse needed to come inside. "Can it walk?" Nora asked. Helen looked at her over the cup. "If it can reach you." "How far did you walk to get here?" "I followed the fence line. The posts are above the snow if you know where to look." Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she put on everything she owned in the way of cold weather protection. Every layer, every piece of wool, the coat she saved for the worst nights. She found the length of rope she kept by the door for exactly this kind of situation and tied one end to the porch post and coiled the rest over her shoulder. "Stay here," she said to Helen. "Get warm. Open the trap door in the floor when I knock on it from below." Helen looked at her. "What are you doing?" "I'm bringing your horse in through my barn." She went back into the storm. She followed the fence line the way Helen had described, one gloved hand on the posts when she could find them, the rope paying out behind her as she moved a lifeline back to the cabin that she did not let go of even when the wind pushed her sideways and the snow blew so thick she could not see her own extended arm. The cold was a physical weight. It pressed on every surface, found every gap in her clothing, turned her fingers into objects she could feel but not trust. She counted fence posts. She counted her steps. She kept moving. She found Helen's surviving horse against the lee side of the buried barn, standing in the partial shelter of the barn wall with its head down and its sides heaving in the particular shallow rhythm of an animal that was still alive, but had stopped believing it would remain so. She put the lead rope on its halter and pulled, and the horse came, because horses will follow a human toward warmth if they have any strength left to follow anything, and this one had just enough. The trip back took longer than the trip out. She did not allow herself to think about the temperature or the wind or the distance. She thought about the fence post. She thought about the next fence post and then the one after that, and she kept the horse moving behind her through the snow that was sometimes knee-deep and sometimes hip-deep, depending on how the wind had arranged it. When she reached the porch, she knocked 3 times on the exterior wall of the cabin, the signal she had told Helen to listen for, and a moment later she heard the trapdoor open from below. She led the horse around to the back of the cabin where she had built the exterior tunnel entrance, the low-sloped passage that emerged through the back foundation wall into the stable below. She had built it for ventilation and waste removal, wider than it needed to be for those purposes, because she had not been entirely sure yet what she might eventually need it for. Tonight she knew. The horse went through it without hesitation. Animals in extremis do not argue with shelter. She followed it down and found Helen's mare in the stable, standing between Scout's stall and the back wall, breathing hard, shaking with the shaking that meant cold had gotten deep into the muscles and needed time to release. Nora covered her with the last blanket. She brought water. She stood with her hand on the mare's neck and felt the shaking begin very slowly to subside as the 50-degree air of the stable worked on the cold that had built up in the horse's body over 2 days of a Wyoming blizzard. 3 horses in a space built for 2, Scout calm, Ember attentive to her filly, and Helen's mare shaking herself back to life in the corner. Nora climbed the stairs and found Helen standing at the top of them. Helen looked down at the stable below. She looked at the 3 horses. She looked at the filly, 2 days old, standing in the straw with her improbable legs and her alert ears. She stood on the stairs and looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. Then she came the rest of the way down and sat on the bottom step and put her face in her hands. Nora sat beside her and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to a woman who had just lost one horse after 2 days of fighting for it, in conditions that would have broken most people, and nothing that needed to be said to explain what she was sitting in the middle of this warm, impossible space that should not have existed and did. She just sat beside Helen and let the silence be what it was. The storm ended on January 12th. It did not end gently. It simply stopped the way Wyoming storms sometimes stop between 1 hour and the next, the wind dropping and the snow ceasing and the sky clearing to the particular hard blue that followed the worst weather, as though the sky were demonstrating its capacity for beauty directly after demonstrating its capacity for destruction. Nora dug out through the cabin door on the morning of the 13th. The landscape was unrecognizable in the specific way that extreme snowfall made landscapes unrecognizable, not because things were missing, but because the shapes were all wrong. The familiar geometry of fence and building and open ground replaced by an undifferentiated white that had its own geography, its own rises and hollows and hard ridges, where the wind had packed the snow into formations that would stand for weeks. Several families in the territory had lost horses. She heard about it as news reached her over the following days, the kind of news that moved through a frontier community in the aftermath of disaster, specific and without embellishment. This family lost two. That family lost one and nearly lost another. A barn 3 miles north had its roof collapse under the snow weight. A family further out had not been able to check on their animals for the full 5 days and had found what they found when the storm ended. She heard all of it. She said little in response. She was not glad about other people's losses. She was not interested in demonstrating the contrast between their outcomes and hers. She had built what she built for reasons that had nothing to do with being right in public. The results were what they were. Silas Greer came to her property on January 17th. He came alone, which she had not expected. No lawyer, no assessor, no one from the land office. He rode up to the cabin on a horse that moved carefully through the snow that still lay deep across the yard, and he tied it to the porch post and knocked. She opened the door. He looked older than he had in his parlor the previous spring. Not dramatically older, not changed in any way she could have described precisely, but the winter had put something in his face that had not been there before. A quality of assessment of a man who had been measuring something against an internal standard and had arrived at an answer he was still working out what to do with. "I heard what happened here," he said. She waited. "I'd like to see it," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let him in. She opened the trap door in the cabin floor and stood to one side. Silas Greer looked at the opening. He looked at the staircase descending below the floor level. He looked at her. Then he put his foot on the first step and went down. She did not follow him immediately. She waited at the top of the stairs and listened to his footsteps on the treads, the particular sound of a heavy man moving carefully in an unfamiliar space. She heard him reach the bottom. She heard the soft movements of the horses acknowledging a new presence. She heard nothing else for a long time. When she did go down, she found him standing in the center of the stable between the two stalls with his hands at his sides. He was looking at the filly, who had grown noticeably in 10 days and was doing the things 10-day-old foals do, investigating the edges of the stall and occasionally startling herself with her own movement and recovering with the overcompensated dignity of a young animal that did not want anyone to notice it had startled. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. He looked at the ventilation shafts. He looked at the earth walls and the ceiling of boards above them. He looked at the drainage channels and the sump pit in the corner. His face held the expression of a man who had constructed a precise understanding of something over a long period of time and was now standing in the evidence that his understanding had been wrong. He stood there for what might have been 5 minutes. Nora waited. When he looked at her, there was nothing in his expression that could be described as defeat. It was a more complicated thing than that. It was the look of a man old enough to have been wrong before and experienced enough to know that the right response to being wrong was not to find a way to make the wrongness mean something other than what it meant. He reached into his coat. He drew out a folded piece of paper and held it for a moment. Then he set it on the flat rail of the stall beside him. He had crossed it through with a single diagonal line in dark ink, and at the bottom beneath the crossed text he had written his name. "Debts paid, Mrs. Calloway," he said. He climbed the stairs and walked through the cabin and out the door. She heard his horse move away through the snow. She stood alone in the stable and looked at the paper on the stall rail. $340. Edmund's debt, written in Edmund's careful hand in June of 1877, the year before the cough started, and the world contracted to the dimensions of a sick man's room, and then to the dimensions of what came after. She picked up the paper and looked at it for a moment, then folded it along the crease Greer had made and put it in her coat pocket. Ember was watching her from the far stall. The filly was standing close against her mother's side, already less uncertain on her feet than she had been 3 days ago, already beginning to show in the set of her ears, in the direction of her attention, the particular quality of curiosity that made a horse worth breeding. Scout was eating. She climbed the stairs and closed the trapdoor behind her and stood in the cabin in the middle of the afternoon light that came through the window onto the plank floor. The stove was burning low. Outside, the snow lay across the yard in the patient way it lay in January, as though it intended to stay forever, though she knew better than that. Spring would come. It always came. It came to everyone who made it through. By summer, the filly would be running. In June, Helen Pratt came to her with paper and a pen and sat at the work table and asked her to explain everything from the beginning. Not just the dimensions or the construction details, but the thinking behind it. The reasoning that had led from the cold of that first winter, alone to the idea of going under the ground rather than fighting the air above it. Helen wrote it all down in her careful handwriting and asked questions when she did not understand something and wrote down the answers too. She was not the only one who came. 5 families rode out that summer to ask about the stable below the cabin floor. Nora showed each of them what she had built and explained what had worked and what she would do differently. She told them about the ventilation ratio and the importance of the drainage channels and the specific depth required to reach the ground temperature that made the difference between a stable that stayed at 50 degrees and one that merely stayed at 35. She told them about the granite ledge and what it had cost her in time and what she had learned from it about planning for what the ground might contain, rather than only what she hoped it would. Some of them were farmers who had lost animals in the January storm. Some of them were ranchers whose operations were large enough to absorb the losses, but who had done the arithmetic on what those losses represented over years and decades, and had decided the arithmetic was worth addressing. A few were women living alone on frontier land who had read in what Nora had done something that spoke to conditions they recognized from their own lives. She told all of them the same thing she had told Edmund when she had explained the idea to herself for the first time in the dark on the stone floor, with her palm pressed flat against the surface. The earth holds what the air cannot. It is not a clever trick. It is not a matter of being smarter than the cold. It is a matter of understanding what the ground has always been willing to offer and building accordingly. By the winter of 1882, 8 underground stables had been completed in the territory. All 8 families reported the same results. Animals that came through the cold season in better condition than before. Fewer deaths, lower feed costs because animals that were not burning their reserves to generate heat required less fuel to maintain themselves. And the thing that no one had thought to name as a benefit until they experienced it for themselves, the ability to check on their livestock in any weather without risking their own lives to do it. The filly Nora called January sold in the fall of 1880 to a buyer from Cheyenne who had heard about the Callaway horses from 3 different people and ridden north to see for himself. He looked at January for a long time and asked about her temperament and her health history and the conditions she had been born and raised in. Nora answered all of his questions directly. He paid more than she had asked for. She paid the debt in September of 1880 on the date specified in the original note to the Greer Land Office account through the Territorial Bank. She did this not because she was required to, since Greer had already voided the note in January, but because she had said she would pay, and she intended to have the records show that she had. The land office received the payment and issued a clear title to the eastern 40 acres. The creek ran where it had always run. Nora stayed on the property for 17 more years. She bred and sold horses and trained foals and became known across a widening radius of the territory as a woman whose animals were worth the trip to see. Buyers talked about the condition of Callaway horses, the steadiness of their temperament, the quality of their coats in winter, the way they moved. She did not explain to most of them that the horses had been born and raised in a space below the ground, where the temperature stayed constant and the cold could not reach them, and nothing had ever required them to be afraid of weather. She let the horses speak for themselves. In the spring of 1897, she sold the property. She gave the buyers a complete description of everything on the land, including the stable below the cabin floor. She explained the ventilation system and the drainage channels and the staircase and the exterior tunnel. She explained the depth and the construction and the maintenance it required. The buyers listened politely. They were from the East and they had different ideas about what a barn should look like. Within 2 seasons, they had filled the stable with earth and timber and built a conventional structure in the yard 30 feet from the cabin door. She heard about it years later from Helen, who had stayed on her own property and continued to use the underground stable she had built in 1880 and maintained ever since. Nora did not go back to see what had been done. She did not need to. She knew what was under that floor. She knew what the ground held down there below the boards, below the stone foundation Edmund had laid with such care in the dark, in the steady temperature, in the quiet that the earth provided to everything it kept. She knew because she had built it, and because she had been down those stairs 1,000 times in every condition the territory could produce. She had been down those stairs in January, in the worst storm in memory, and she had found 50 degrees and 2 horses and a newborn filly who had never known a world that wanted to kill her. The cold could not reach what the earth held close. She had known this. She had gone down into the ground and proven it when no one believed her, and the proof had cost her everything she had except the thing she was trying to protect. That was enough. That had always been enough.